Chapter 1. The Horns of Unity. The Drakwald forest breathed rot and old hatred. Its towering trees were twisted, things bark puckered like leprous skin, boughs tangled into claws, and roots writhing through the black earth like buried serpents. Fog lay low and thick, reeking of blood, musk, and meat gone sour. The undergrowth never stayed still. Something always watched. Something always moved. It was here, amid the moss-slicked bones of forgotten travelers and the charred wreckage of a Sigmarite shrine, that Gothak Onehorn emerged from the mire. He stank of power. His hide was mangy and matted with filth, his back hunched beneath a lattice of ruined bones and dangling fetishes, charms made from baby teeth, skaven skulls, and hollowed-out, manling eyes. Where a second horn should have been, only a broken stump remained, torn long ago in battle and cauterized with warp flame. His lone remaining horn spiraled upward long, black, and crusted with dried gore. His fingers clutched a staff of ashwood, bound with sinew and topped with a shard of something that pulsed softly, like a heartbeat carved in crystal, the waystone. It whispered to him in his dreams. It fed him names, images, and new gods. Tonight he would make them listen. Across the clearing, 3 warherds had gathered, each clan a festering boil of beastman hierarchy and violence. Gors stamped and bellowed. Bestigors paced like caged predators, and the lesser Ungors huddled, eager for meat and afraid of attention. The herds had come reluctantly, drawn by omens. The blood moon, the wailing of trees, the birds that fell from the sky with their eyes pecked from within. But most of all, they had come because Gothak had taken the Fanghorn totem, shattering it and desecrating its bearer before all. It was not an invitation, it was a challenge. Atop a jagged rock outcropping, Gothak raised his staff. The waystone shard flared within a light, sickly and blue-green, seeping out in slow pulses like fluid from an open wound. "I speak for the stag," he bellowed. His voice rasped like rusted blades across bone. "He rises, horned, hung, and hungry." The herds roared in response, but not in agreement. Challenge, mockery, threats. One hurled a cracked femur at him, another spat bile. From the crowd, a bestigor with twin axes slung across his back stepped forward. His snout was crisscrossed with scars, and one of his horns bore iron rings hammered through it like piercings. "Mogthrak doesn't kneel," the bestigor growled, voice like grinding millstones. "Not to one-horned dung beasts, not to phantom gods carved on elfstone." Snorts and bellows of agreement rippled through the assembled warherds. Some began to chant Mogthrak's name, stomping hooves and rattling weapons. Others barked challenge in their own tongue, raw-throated and full of bloodlust. Gothak didn't move. His staff remained raised. "Then bleed," he hissed. Mogthrak charged. There was no ceremony, no posturing, just sudden, thundering violence. The bestigor bounded up the rock like a bear on all fours, snarling, eyes white with fury. One axe came down in an arc meant to cleave Gothak's head from his shoulders. But the shaman was faster. He ducked low, staff spinning. The waystone shard cracked against Mogthrak's wrist with a sound like frozen wood splitting. The bestigor howled, dropping his axe, and lashed out with his tusked jaws. Teeth scraped against bone charms as Gothak drove a thumb into the warrior's eye with a wet pop. Mogthrak reeled, blinded, blood streaming down his cheek like war paint. Gothak seized his moment. He gripped the bestigor's matted mane and rammed his horn into the brute's throat, not deep, not killing, but enough to draw a red spurt and drive Mogthrak backward, off the stone. He hit the forest floor with a crunch and a bellow, scrambling to rise. The herds watched in stunned silence. Gorthak leapt down, landing like a carcass hurled from a height. He raised his staff again, and this time the waystone pulsed so brightly it painted the clearing in eerie green. The fog seemed to draw in closer, thickening, clinging. "He bleeds before the stag," Gorthak cried. "His blood feeds the hungering root." The roots around the clearing twisted unnaturally. Bark split from the forest's edge. A tree revealed itself, not by moving, but by being noticed. It had not been there before. It should not have fit between the other trunks, but it stood now, impossibly broad and knotted, its branches arching like gallows. Its boughs were lined with nooses, woven from gut and sinew. Gorthak gestured to it. "Offer him," he said, voice low but carrying. "Let his death seal our pact." There was a long, heavy silence. Then a Bestigor stepped forward, not from Mogthrak's tribe, but another painted in ash and dried blood, bearing scars in the shape of moons. He dragged Mogthrak up by the throat. The wounded warrior struggled, sputtering blood and rage. Another came, then another. They did not speak. They strung him up with brutal efficiency. Mogthrak thrashed and kicked, claws digging at the noose, eyes rolling white as the blood rushed to his face. The rope creaked. His legs danced above the earth, then twitched, then stilled. The forest sighed. No wind stirred, but the branches moved. The hanging trees shuddered, and something black and wet dripped from the bark. A low hum filled the clearing, like breath caught in a massive throat. Gorthak smiled with cracked, yellow teeth. "The stag is pleased," he said. "Unity through sacrifice, strength through the noose. Tomorrow we raid the manling village. The stag shall taste their children's marrow." The herds bellowed. This time, in agreement. They stamped and screamed, crashing weapons against tree trunks and each other. Already, eyes turned to other champions, rivals, elders, shamans. Who would hang next? Who would buy luck with their life? But none dared challenge Gorthak now. That night, in a shallow cave beneath the hanging tree, Gorthak knelt before the waystone shard. It lay nestled in a bowl of flayed skin, blood dripping from its edge. The runes on its surface crawled and twisted, reshaping themselves slowly, agonizingly, like maggots carving words into meat. He watched. He listened. The words formed. "Let the strong swing, so the herd may thrive." "Gorthak," he said, in ecstasy. The tree outside groaned as the first vultures settled on Mogthrak's shoulders, and deep in the roots something stirred. Chapter 2. The first hanging. Firelight made the clearing feel like a wound that refused to close. Flames hunched low in pits of cracked stone, licking at heaps of rancid tallow and splintered bone. The smoke did not rise cleanly. It crawled, thick and sour, threading through the ankles of the warherd like a fog with intent. The Drakwold pressed in from all sides, crooked trunks and thorn-choked undergrowth forming a living palisade, as if the forest itself had decided this circle of trampled earth belonged to it and no one else. In the center stood the stag tree. It was not the oldest tree in these woods, but it carried a presence like a raised blade. Its trunk leaned a fraction forward, as though listening. One branch jutted outward at shoulder height, long and warped, antler-like in its crookedness. From that branch hung a noose thick, fibrous, twisted from sinew and gut, stiff with old stains that caught the firelight like dried varnish. The rope swayed. There was no wind. Gorthak Onehorn stood beneath the branch, his shadow thrown huge against the bark. He wore his grime like a cloak. Fetishes clacked and whispered on his ribs, teeth charms, small bones etched with marks that were half prayer and half threat. His lone horn spiraled up from his brow like a black hook, scarred and glazed from 100 cuts. Around his neck and across his chest ran a lattice of wire and hammered copper, binding the waystone shard tight against his hide. The shard glowed with a sickly, captive light. Not bright, never bright, more like the pale shine of something submerged and struggling under ice. It pulsed in slow beats, and each beat seemed to tug at the clearing. The firelight warped, shadows shivered. A few of the Ungors at the back of the ring flinched every time it thrummed, as if struck in the teeth. The herds had come in a tense, ugly truce. Gors packed the front, thick-necked brutes, with chipped horns and crude cleavers, breath steaming in the cold. Behind them loomed bestigors, taller, broader, their armor a patchwork of hammered iron and scavenged mail, their eyes gleaming with predatory patience. Ungors skulked at the edges, small and quick, hungry for scraps of status and terrified of being noticed by anyone larger than them. Each herd had its own stink, its own markings, its own grudges. They stood together anyway, because the Drakwold had been speaking, not in words, never in words, but in signs. A stag skull found freshly bleached atop a cairn of human spears, a dead raven with its beak stuffed with moss and hair, the moon's sickly smear across the clouds like a bruise. They had followed those signs here, grumbling and snarling, and now they waited for blood. Mogthrak stepped into the ring as though it belonged to him. He was a Bestigor champion, and he wore that truth like a crown made of scars. His horn swept back heavy and blunt, carved with kill marks filled with pitch. His mane was braided tight with leather thongs, and trophies clicked at his belt with every step, jawbones, finger bones, bits of polished metal taken from the dead. 2 axes rode his shoulders, their edges dulled by old work and sharpened again and again until the steel looked pitted and hungry. He stopped 10 paces from Gorthak and spat onto the ground. "This place stinks of tricks," Mogthrak snarled. His voice carried without effort a deep, grinding sound that made the nearest Ungors recoil. "You talk of unity like a manling priest. You hold up Elfstone and call it prophecy. But the herds don't follow whispers. We follow strength." A rumble of approval rolled around the ring. Hooves stamped, horns dipped. Several Gors barked Mogthrak's name like a challenge and a promise. Gorthak did not move. His gaze was fixed on Mogthrak with the cold patience of a carrion bird waiting for something to stop twitching. "The herds follow hunger," Gorthak rasped. "And the stag is hungry." Mogthrak laughed, sharp and contemptuous, and he swung 1 axe down into his hands. The firelight caught along its edge. "Then let your stag watch," he said. "I will crack your skull and see what crawls inside." He charged. It was not a duel with rules or ceremony. It was the simple grammar of the beastmen, dominance written in impact, status measured in how many stood up afterward. Mogthrak came in low and fast, hooves digging furrows in the ash, shoulders rolling like a battering ram. His axe rose in a brutal arc, meant to end the argument in 1 stroke. Gorthak snapped his staff up. Not to block, no staff could take that full blow cleanly, but to divert. The shaft struck Mogthrak's forearm with a hard crack, turning the axe's path just enough that the blade bit into dirt rather than bone. Sparks spat. Mogthrak snarled and surged forward anyway, ramming his shoulder into Gorthak's chest. The impact drove breath from the shaman and sent him skidding back. Fetishes clattered. The waystone shard flared, and the shadows around Gorthak's feet thickened as if the ground had turned to tar. Mogthrak followed, swinging again, faster now, anger sharpening his already savage focus. The second axe came around, a horizontal cut meant to split ribs and drop the shaman in the mud. Gothak ducked under it with a twist that looked wrong for his hunched frame, too quick, too fluid. His staff snapped up, jabbing into Mogthrak's throat. Not deep, not piercing, just a hard, punishing strike that stole the champion's breath and made him stumble half a step. That half step was all Gothak needed. He drove the butt of his staff into Mogthrak's knee. The Bestigor's leg buckled, and his balance faltered. Gothak surged in close, grabbing a fistful of mane and yanking Mogthrak's head down toward the dirt. Mogthrak fought like a trapped animal. His elbow slammed back into Gothak's ribs. His horn caught the shaman's shoulder and tore cloth and hide in a searing scrape. He twisted, trying to bring a blade up between them. Gothak snarled, less in pain than in triumph, and slammed his forehead into Mogthrak's face. Horn met horn. A sound like stone cracking echoed through the clearing. Mogthrak reeled, vision briefly lost. Gothak shoved him backward and kicked one of the fallen axes away into the ring of watching beastmen. The crowd roared. The sound split between delight and outrage. Some surged forward instinctively, others held them back, hungry to see how it ended. Mogthrak spat dark saliva and steadied himself with the remaining axe. He lifted it again, but now his stance had changed. The champion's confidence had cracked. Rage remained, there was always rage, but beneath it ran something sharper. Caution. You're not strong, Mogthrak growled. You're touched. Gothak's grin showed too many teeth. Yes, he whispered. And so is this place. The waystone shard pulsed hard enough that the air seemed to thicken. The stag tree groaned. Several heads turned toward it involuntarily, as if a hand had guided their chins. The noose swayed once, slow and deliberate, like a finger curling in invitation. Mogthrak felt the shift too. His nostrils flared, his eyes narrowed. He hesitated. That single hesitation was the end. The herds moved not as one in disciplined unity, but as one in shared instinct. Hunger recognized hunger. The prophecy, real or not, had lodged itself in their skulls like a splinter. They had watched Gothak stand against Mogthrak and not break. They had felt the shard's pulse. They had seen the noose waiting. It was enough. Two Bestigors from a rival herd lunged forward and seized Mogthrak's arms. He roared and tried to wrench free, horns dipping to gore, but more bodies slammed into him. Gores grabbing his waist, Ungors swarming to hook ropes around his wrists like eager vermin. Mogthrak fought them with animal ferocity. He headbutted one Gore so hard the brute staggered back, stunned. He drove a shoulder into another and sent him sprawling. He snapped his jaws at an Ungor and tore the creature's ear off with a savage shake, flinging it away into the firelight. But numbers are a weapon all their own. Hands locked on him, horns hooked his limbs, a rope cinched around his throat. He was dragged, hooves scraping furrows, toward the stag tree. Gothak walked behind them, staff tapping the ground in a slow rhythm like a drum beat. Prophecy, he rasped, lifting the shard so its light washed over Mogthrak's struggling form. Luck, victory. The herd thrives when the strong swing. Mogthrak's eyes burned with hate. He bared his teeth. This isn't strength, he choked. It's cowardice. It's hunger. Gothak corrected softly. They forced Mogthrak beneath the branch. The noose dangled at face height, almost polite in its patience. One of the Bestigors reached up and pulled it open. Mogthrak's gaze flicked upward. For the first time, something like unease cracked through his fury. Not fear of dying, beastmen were not built for that kind of fear, but a sense of wrongness, of being offered to something that was not simply death. He tried to speak. tried to spit another curse. The noose slipped over his horns and down his neck. The crowd's roar fell away into a tense hush, the way a forest stills before a storm breaks. No one later claimed it kicked Mogthrak's legs out from under him. The rope snapped taut. His body jerked hard, suspended beneath the crooked branch. The noose tightened. His hooves scrabbled for purchase on empty air, finding nothing. His shoulders strained. His hands clawed at the rope, but the knot sat like a cruel certainty beneath his jaw. He kicked, twisting, fighting the inevitable with furious disbelief. The branch creaked, but held. The stag tree shuddered, not like wood in wind, like flesh reacting to touch. A ripple ran down the trunk, and the bark seemed to tighten, as if the tree were swallowing a laugh. The firelight flickered, and in that flicker Gorthak saw its faces, half-formed in the knots of the bark, cheekbones and eye sockets suggested by shadow, mouths that weren't carved, but pressed out from within, watching. Mogthrak's struggle slowed. His strength did not fail quickly, but it did fail. His kicks grew less coordinated. His shoulders sagged. His head tilted at an unnatural angle as the rope did its work. The clearing held its breath until the champion's motion stilled into a faint, occasional twitch. Then the herds exhaled in a roar, so loud it scattered roosting birds from the trees. They surged around the hanging body like a tide, howling, stamping, hammering weapons against shields and trunks. Some threw handfuls of ash into the air. Others smeared Mogthrak's falling sweat and grime across their own faces like sacred paint. A few Ungors danced close, darting in to snatch at the dead champion's belt trophies until a Bestigor cuffed them away. Gorthak stood at the base of the tree and pressed his palm to the trunk. It felt warm, too warm for dead wood. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids, he saw the Drakwold as a throat, the clearing as a tongue, and the stag tree as a tooth sunk deep into flesh. He felt something drink slow, satisfied through the roots. When he opened his eyes, the waystone shard had changed. Runes crawled across its surface like living wounds, knitting themselves into words. They settled, sharp and certain, as if carved by an invisible knife. Gorthak read them aloud, voice low but carrying through the noise as if the sound itself made space for his words. Hang the horned, the dark shall feed. The roar that followed was different. Not celebration alone, something uglier threaded through it. Zeal, a bright, cruel hunger turning inward. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, horns dipped in appraisal. Who else was horned enough? Who else was strong enough to buy the herd's luck? Gorthak swallowed. The thrill in his chest suddenly edged with dread. The prophecy wasn't merely guiding them, it was aiming them, and it was aiming them at themselves. By dawn, the herds had moved. They flowed through the Drakwold like a bruise spreading under skin, silent where they needed to be silent, violent when silence broke. Gorthak walked at the center, the shard tucked against him, its pulse setting the rhythm of their march. They found the manlings near an old hunter's track, a patrol of Middenland soldiers, cloaked against the cold, pikes on shoulders, helmets glinting faintly through the trees. 10, maybe 12, disciplined, wary, tired in the way men always were when the forest wouldn't stop making sounds behind them. The beastmen did not charge screaming. They waited. They let the patrol pass into a narrow stretch where thorn and trunk tightened the path. Ungors slipped behind, quick as rats. Bestigors crouched ahead, muscles coiled. Gors gripped crude blades, with a reverence that looked almost like prayer. When the first soldier stepped beneath a low branch, the trap sprang. A thrown stone cracked a helmet and staggered the led man. A rope snapped tight around another's leg and yanked him down into the mud. Ungors surged in with knives, slashing straps and hamstrings to drop men before they could form ranks. Bastigors hit like falling iron axes, rising and falling in heavy, chopping arcs that broke shields and sent bodies tumbling. The patrol fought, to their credit. A pike drove through an Ungor's chest and pinned him to a tree. A sword flashed and opened a Gor's throat, sending him gurgling to his knees. A soldier in a wolf-pelt cloak bellowed orders and tried to rally the line, but the forest itself seemed to muffle him. Gorthak raised the waystone shard, and its light leaked between the trees like swamp glow. For a heartbeat the soldiers faltered, not from fear of beastmen, but from the wrongness of that light. It painted their armor sickly green. It turned their breath into pale smoke that looked like souls fleeing. Then the herd closed. Steel rang on steel. Wood splintered. Men shouted prayers that were swallowed by snarls. One soldier went down beneath 3 Ungors, his cries cutting short as they clung to him like parasites. Another tried to flee and was taken by a Bestigor that simply ran him down, the impact hurling him into a tree so hard he did not get up again. In minutes, it was over. The survivors, 2, maybe 3, were dragged into the brush, weapons stripped away, faces pressed into the dirt. They sobbed, swore, begged, threatened, prayed. The herds laughed, not kindly. Gorthak stood over them, chest heaving, and listened to the forest around him. The Drakwold was quiet now, as if satisfied, as if it had eaten and was licking its teeth. No beastman had fallen in the ambush save a couple of Ungor's small losses, hardly counted. The herds turned to Gorthak with gleaming eyes, the kind that saw connection where there was only coincidence, proof where there was only hunger. The Noose brings luck. Someone growled reverently. The stag smiles. Another hissed. Hang more. An Ungor squeaked, emboldened by the blood on his hands. Gorthak did not answer. He stared at the nearest tree trunk, at the rough bark webbed with fungus and old scars. A face stared back. Not carved, not imagined. There, a suggestion of a brow ridge, a hollow where an eye should be, filled with shadow that seemed too deep, a mouth line that looked almost like a grin. He blinked, hard, and it was only bark again. But when he looked away, he felt it, the sense of being watched from every direction, not by eyes in the brush, but by the wood itself, by the roots beneath his hooves, by the canopy overhead. That night, back in the firelit clearing, Mogthrak's corpse still hung from the stag branch, turning slowly in the darkness. The noose was stained darker now, as if it had absorbed more than sweat and death. The tree's bark looked slick in places, as though damp with fresh sap. Gorthak knelt before the shard and watched the runes crawl again. He did not feel triumph. He felt appetite. The words settled into place with a certainty that made his stomach knot. Hang the horned, the dark shall feed. Outside, the herds began arguing loud, heated, hungry arguments. Names were spat like curses. Old grudges sharpened into new accusations. The strongest began to look at each other not as allies, but as offerings, as currency. Gorthak lifted his gaze to the stag tree. In the firelight, the knots in the bark seemed to shift, the suggestion of eyes blinking in slow, patient rhythm, and in the shadowed canopy above, the noose swayed gently inviting, promising though the night air was dead still. Chapter 3. The feeding tray. The hanging glade had become a cathedral, not of stone and stained glass, of bark and bone, rope and rot. The Drakwold's branches arched overhead like warped ribs, knitting a canopy that swallowed starlight and made the moon a sick smear behind clouds. Fire pits ringed the clearing in a rough circle, their flames guttering low, casting a greasy sheen across everything they touched. Smoke clung to the ground and crawled through the grass in lazy coils, as if the forest exhaled and refused to breathe it back in. At the center stood the stag tree. It was thicker now. It should not have been possible for a tree to grow so fast, not without seasons, not without sun. But the stag tree had never cared for natural laws. Its trunk had swollen like a muscle flexing. Knots bulged beneath the bark in the suggestion of faces, cheekbones, half-lidded eyes, mouths stretched into silent laughter. The main limb that served as gallows had multiplied, splitting into crooked antler branches that reached outward, each heavy with swaying shapes. Bodies, not one, not two, dozens. They hung in rows and clusters, rope creaking softly as they turned in the still air. Some were champions, thick-limbed and scarred, their horns carved with marks of old victories. Some were shamans, hung with their charms still rattling, their tongues blackened, their eyes dull as stones. Some were lesser beasts, ungors and runts hung not for prophecy, but because zeal always needed practice, and the smallest throats were easiest to cinch. The clearing reeked of old sweat, ash, and something sweeter beneath it all. The cloying stink of sap and decay mingled together. The tree bled now. Dark sap oozed from seams in the bark and pooled at the roots like spilled oil. Where it touched the ground, moss died in tight circles. Where it sank into the soil, the roots pulsed thick chords rising and falling in slow rhythm, as though the earth had a heartbeat. Gorthak One Horn watched it all from the shadow of a leaning stone, his staff clenched hard enough to whiten the knuckles beneath his fur. He had wanted unity. He had gotten worship. And worship, he was learning, did not stop when its priest grew afraid. Every night, the waystone shard changed. It lay in Gorthak's hands like a captured star, cold one moment and fever-hot the next. Its surface crawled with runes that never sat still for long, letters shaping themselves, dissolving, reforming into new verses as though something inside the stone were chewing words and spitting them back out. The herds gathered at dusk like carrion birds, waiting for the prophecy as if it were meat. The first verse had demanded a hanging. The second had promised feeding. Now the verses came quicker, sharper, more insistent, each one a hook set deeper into the herd's skull. Swing the brave, and the rage shall bloom. Spill the proud, and the path is clear. Bind the horned, and the dark shall smile. The herd obeyed, not because they understood, but because it worked. Their raids had grown cleaner, their ambushes cruelly efficient. Human patrols vanished into the Drakwold and did not return. Watchtowers burned at the forest's edge. Once, a band of armored knights tried to push into the trees only to stagger out days later, broken and half-mad, armor dented and stained, their horses gone. The beastmen hunted them down in the fields like sport. The herds called it luck. Gorthak began to call it something else. Hunger. Tonight, the ring around the stag tree was thicker than ever. The warherds pressed in close, faces lit by the sick, low fires. Their eyes shone with zeal now, an ugly brightness that hadn't been there before. They did not look at each other like rivals. They looked like gamblers, each desperate to place the next bet. A chant rolled across the glade, rising and falling like breathing. Stag, stag, stag. Gorthak raised the shard. The chanting died into a hush that felt too heavy, like the forest pressing a hand over every mouth. Even the rope seemed to quiet. The bodies swayed, but more slowly, as though listening. The runes on the shard crawled Gorthak's throat tightened. He didn't want to read. Not anymore. But the shard's glow seeped into his eyes, and the words arrived in his mind with the certainty of a knife's edge. He spoke anyway, because the herd demanded it, because the shard demanded it, because the Drakwold itself felt like it would tighten around his ribs if he refused. Let the bull swing, let the herd drink deep. The hush shattered. A roar went up so loud it seemed to shake leaves from the branches. Hooves stomped. Weapons banged against shields and bark. Several bestigors laughed, the sound jagged and eager. From the back of the ring, something massive moved forward. A minotaur bull. He was a slab of muscle and scar tissue, taller than two manlings stacked, his horns thick as tree limbs. Iron rings pierced the ridges above his eyes, and chains draped across his shoulders like stolen trophies. His breath steamed in harsh bursts, and every step sank into the earth with weight that made the ground tremble. They had called him Urak, the gore-drunk. A beast that had once belonged to no herd at all, just a roaming storm of violence that took what it wanted. Now, half a dozen ropes were looped around his arms and throat, hauled taut by a pack of bestigors and braver gors. Urak bellowed a deep, furious sound that vibrated in the chest. He jerked against the ropes, dragging two of his handlers forward in a stumbling lurch. One fell, and before anyone could pull him clear, Urak's hoof slammed down on the gore's chest with a dull crunch. The brute didn't rise. The herd howled in approval. "Lucky," someone hissed. "Stag's hungry," another answered. Reverent. Gorthak stared. Sick. This wasn't sacrifice chosen by wisdom. It was sacrifice chosen by appetite. And appetite, once fed, did not learn restraint. Urak fought as they dragged him toward the stag tree. He swung his head and caught a bestigor with the side of a horn, sending the warrior tumbling end over end into the firelight. He threw his shoulder into another and sent him crashing into the roots. The Minotaur's chains clattered, and his hooves tore gouges in the earth. But the herd had learned. They came with more ropes, more bodies, more cruel patience. Ungors darted in to slash at his ankles, not to kill, but to weaken quick cuts that made him stumble and rage. A shaman, one of Gorthak's own, screeched a curse and flung ash into Urak's eyes. The bull roared, blind and furious, and the ropes tightened. They forced him under the antler branch. The noose waiting for him was thicker than the others, braided from multiple cords, dark with old stains. It looked horribly like it had grown from the tree itself. Urak sensed the trap even through pain and blindness. He dug his hooves in and refused to move. The ropes strained, muscles bulged. For a heartbeat it looked as though he might rip free and scatter the crowd like straw. Then the stag tree moved. A root, thick as a man's torso, rose from the earth with a wet sound and curled around Urak's shin. Another slid up and wrapped his other leg. The bull's hooves skidded uselessly as the roots pinned him in place, holding him steady the way a butcher steadies meat. The crowd went very still. Gorthak felt cold wash through him, as if the night had opened a mouth at the back of his neck. The tree wasn't just standing there. It was participating. It was helping. Hands shoved the noose up and over Urak's horns. The loop tightened around his throat. The bull's roar turned into a choking rasp. The rope went taut. Urak's body jerked once, violent, instinctive, then hung heavy, legs kicking in slow, furious arcs as his strength drained into the air. The roots held him, stopping him from twisting free. The antler branch creaked but did not break. The herd watched in rapture. When Urak finally stilled into uneasy, occasional motion, the chant began again lower, more intimate, like a prayer spoken into a lover's ear. Stag, Stag, Stag. Gorthak's hands shook so hard he nearly dropped the shard. He turned away, retching bile into the ash. No one noticed. Or worse, no one cared. They had passed beyond him, beyond his caution, beyond his intent. The shard had given them a ritual that tasted like victory, and now they would chew it until their teeth broke. Behind him, someone spoke, voice smooth and edged like sharpened bone. "Your god is generous, One Horn." Gorthak stiffened. He knew that voice. Varkul of the Ashbloods stepped into the firelight, his horns wrapped in strips of flayed parchment covered in scribbles. He was a bray shaman, too leaner than Gorthak, with eyes too bright and a grin that never reached them. Charms dangled from his wrists, tiny cages containing insects that still twitched, as if alive. Around his neck hung a necklace of finger bones, human, by the look of them. Varkul's gaze fixed on the waystone shard. "Generous," he repeated. "But gods belong to those who can hold them." Gorthak tightened his grip, drawing the shard close to his chest. The crystal pulsed, warm against his hide, and for a moment he felt something like reassurance, like a hand slipping into his thoughts and squeezing. "Not comfort, possession. You speak too boldly," Gorthak growled. Varkul laughed softly. "Do I? Look around." Gorthak did. The herd's eyes were not on him anymore. Not truly. They were on the tree, on the ropes, on the hanging bodies, on the promise those bodies represented, and now on Varkul, who stood with calm confidence in the heart of the frenzy, as if he belonged at the center. "Your words began it," Varkul murmured, stepping closer. "But the hunger has outgrown you." Gorthak's mind flashed back, unwanted, to the dream that had plagued him for 3 nights. He had been in the elf ruin where he stole the shard, stepping over cracked marble and broken statues. He had thought the place dead, emptied of magic. In the dream, the ruin was alive. The waystone shard had not been a mere fragment. It had been a tooth, chipped from a larger thing, a monolith of pale stone that screamed without sound. Faces were trapped within it, half-formed, pressed into the surface like insects in amber. They stared at him with pleading eyes, and behind them, deeper, was something else. No face, no form, only a vast, patient appetite that pulsed in time with the runes. A devourer, not a god, not a spirit of guidance, a thing that ate worship and made prophecy as bait. In the dream, Gorthak had tried to run, and the forest had become a throat. Branches closed around him like ribs. Roots lashed his legs. The stag tree had been there at the end of every path, its nooses swaying, its bark faces smiling, and the shard's runes had crawled across his own skin like cuts opening and closing. He woke each time with rope-burn marks around his throat that hadn't been there when he slept. Now, in the waking world, he saw the same shape of inevitability in the glade, the same tightening circle. Varkul's hand lifted slightly, palm open toward the shard in a gesture that might have been polite, if not for the hunger behind it. "Give it to me," he said softly. "You've served well. Now let someone wiser steer the herd." Gorthak's lips peeled back from his teeth. His staff rose, point aimed at Varkul's heart. The air thickened. The shard pulsed, and the stag tree creaked overhead, all its nooses stirring at once as if the forest leaned in to watch. Gorthak realized, with a chill that cut deeper than any blade, that the real contest wasn't between him and Varkul. It was between two mouths vying for the same feast. The herd shifted around them, sensing conflict. Bestigors stepped forward, hands tightening on axe hafts. Ungors craned their necks, eager for blood, any blood as long as it fed the ritual. The ropes on the hanging bodies creaked in a slow, steady rhythm. Farkle smiled wider. "See?" he whispered. "They don't need your prophecy anymore. They just need a new throat to speak it." Gorthak's breathing turned ragged. He looked up at Uruk's hulking corpse swaying above the crowd, at the way the roots beneath the stag tree pulsed as though drinking, at the bark faces watching with patient delight. He had wanted to unite the herds, to drown the world in manling blood. Instead, he had built a shrine that would drown them first, and the worst of it, worse than the fear, worse than the guilt, was the faint, awful truth he felt in the shard's pulse. It was pleased. It had him. It had them. It had all the time in the world. Gorthak's staff trembled in his grip as Varkul stepped closer, and the hanging glade leaned in, watching, waiting like a throat preparing to swallow. Chapter 4. The Noose tightens. The eve of the raid came with a sick moon and a forest that would not stop listening. Beyond the Drakwold's ragged edge lay the manling village, half a day's march through tangled brush and mire, a knot of timber halls and palisade stakes squatting in a clearing hacked from the trees. Smoke from their chimneys rose straight in the cold air, clean and pale, like a prayer they still believed someone heard. Their fields were stubbled and winter-thin, their livestock penned close. From afar, it looked almost peaceful. From afar, everything looked peaceful. In the hanging glade, nothing was. The stag tree had grown into a monument of wrongness. Its antler branches reached farther each night, thickening as if they were fed with meat instead of sap. The nooses were no longer crude ropes, now they looked braided with purpose, cords tight and uniform, as though the tree itself had learned the craft. Bodies swayed in tears. Some were old sacrifices, dried and stiff. Some were new, still heavy, still slack with the final surrender. And beneath it all, the roots pulsed, not like a tree drinking water, slow and patient, but like something with blood and appetite. The earth around the trunk had cracked in a starburst pattern, and in those fissures the roots showed themselves pale cords sliding just under the surface, bulging and retreating in a steady rhythm. Every so often a root rose high enough to cast a shadow, then sank again as if ashamed to be seen. The herds encamped around the glade, sharpening blades, daubing themselves with ash and dark paint, gnawing on raw meat torn from earlier kills. The air was full of muttering and chanting. The raid had become a holy thing. They spoke of it the way men spoke of harvest, as if it was owed. Gorthak Onehorn moved among them like a ghost that hadn't yet realized it was dead. He kept the waystone shard bound to his chest, but he could feel it pulling now, not toward him, not toward the herd, but toward the tree. It was a constant tug in his bones, a subtle insistence that made his teeth ache. The runes on its surface crawled more often, and each time they settled they did so with greater confidence, as if the shard had stopped pretending it was merely speaking and begun commanding. The herds no longer looked to Gorthak for permission. They looked to him for confirmation, a stamp upon the madness they already loved. And Varkul of the Ash-Bloods. Varkul watched him with a patience that felt like a knife laid across the throat. The rival shaman had grown bolder with each hanging. He stood nearer to the center of every rite, his soft voice slipping into the chants, his gestures echoing Gorthak's until the herd could no longer tell whose words were whose. He had begun to wear new charms, braided cords that looked suspiciously like miniature nooses, tiny loops hanging from his horns like ornaments. He wanted the shard, and worse, Gorthak knew the shard wanted him to try. The shard did not fear a rival. It fed on rivalry. It fed on certainty. It fed on the herd turning inward, chewing itself into obedience. That was the shape of the trap. The prophecy that didn't guide, but drove. So Gothak chose the only path left to him, one that did not lead to victory, only to defiance. He waited until the camp fell into its lowest, hungriest lull. Not sleep. Beastmen did not sleep like men. They drifted. They dozed with one eye open, hands never far from weapons, minds always ready for violence. But even a warherd had moments when the chanting softened and the fires burned low. When the forest's noises seemed loud in the gaps, Gothak slipped to the stag tree alone. The hanging glade looked different when no one shouted, more honest. The bodies above creaked gently. The ropes made a soft, constant whisper. The bark faces seemed clearer in the quiet knots that suggested eyes, fissures that could be mouths. If you stared too long, you began to believe they moved. He stood at the base of the trunk and pressed his palm against it. Varm. Not sun-warm. Not fire-warm. Flesh-warm. The tree shivered beneath his touch, and for a heartbeat he felt it something vast behind the bark. An attention that slid over him like a tongue-tasting air. Gothak's throat tightened. He forced his breathing steady and unhooked the shard from his chest. The copper wire scraped his hide as he pulled it free. The crystal's glow immediately brightened, as if delighted to be near its altar. No, Hortak Raspet, no more. He lifted his staff, the one topped with bone and old runes, and drew back as though to smash the shard against the tree's roots. The simplest destruction, a blunt end. The shard pulsed hard. The runes on its face shifted in a sudden, violent rearrangement, as if something inside it snarled. For an instant, the crystal's light showed him a vision. The raid, the village, flames, screaming, and the herd crowned in blood, while the stag tree grew so large it blotted out the sky. It was offered like a gift, like temptation. Gothak spat and brought the staff down. Before it struck, the roots moved, not slowly, not tentatively. They snapped upward with whip-fast speed and coiled around his staff, yanking it off course. The blow cracked into the earth instead, sending a jolt up his arms. A second root wrapped his ankle and tugged, trying to pull his leg out from under him. He staggered, and another root slid around his wrist like a cold rope. The stag tree was defending its prize. Gothak snarled and hacked at the root with a jagged flint blade drawn from his belt. The edge bit into the pale cord, and sap welled out dark and viscous. The root tightened in response, crushing his wrist until bones threatened to give. Pain fled white behind his eyes. Above him, the hanging bodies twitched. At first he thought it was the wind. Then he remembered there was no wind. One corpse jerked, shoulders rolling as if waking from a nightmare. Another's head lifted with a stiff, unnatural motion. A third swung forward and then reached arms dangling not loosely, but with intent. Gothak's stomach turned. The dead were not merely decorations. They were hooks. They were tools. The first reanimated corpse dropped from its noose with a wet thud and landed in a crouch that no dead thing should manage. It was a bestigor, skin pulled tight, eyes dull and wrong. Its neck was marked by the deep bruise line of the rope, but it did not gasp. It did not breathe. It simply stared at Gothak, and then it surged forward with a broken weapon clutched in stiff fingers. Gothak yanked his staff free of the root by sheer force and slammed the butt into the corpse's face. Bone cracked. The thing stumbled but did not fall. It swung its weapon in a clumsy arc that still carried enough weight to hurt. The blow clipped Gothak's shoulder, numbing his arm. More bodies dropped. They came down from the branches like rotten fruit, hitting the earth in crooked, crawling heaps. ungores, gores, even one shaman with fetishes still hanging from his ribs. Their movements were jerky and wrong, but they were relentless. They did not feel pain. They did not hesitate. They were animated by the same hunger that pulsed in the roots. Gothak fought like a cornered beast. He smashed one corpse's knee and watched it keep coming on a broken leg. He drove his horn into another's chest, felt ribs give, and still it clawed for his throat. He used his staff to hook a third by the neck and fling it back into the roots, where pale cord seized it and hauled it away like a prize. The glade filled with sound thuds, cracking wood, the rasp of rope, the wet slap of bodies hitting dirt. Not the glorious roaring of battle, but something uglier, the noise of a trap closing. Then, through the chaos, came laughter, soft, pleased, close. Varkul stepped into the firelight at the edge of the roots, hands raised in mock peace. His eyes gleamed bright as coals. Around him, several ash-blood bestigors formed a loose half-circle, weapons ready. "You chose the wrong night to repent," Varkul purred. "The herd is hungry, the stag is hungry, and you, One Horn, you are only now learning what we already know." Gothak spat blood. "It's not a god." Varkul's smile widened. "Does it matter if it works?" Behind Varkul, the shard's glow flickered. Gothak realized, with a cold twist, that the crystal's light had begun to mirror Varkul's movements, as if the shard recognized him as a new hand to hold it. Varkul's voice turned sharper. "Give it to me." The roots tightened around Gothak's ankle again, dragging him a half-step closer to the tree. The corpses pressed in, forcing him back, herding him toward the trunk like dogs pushing prey into a corner. Gothak's mind raced, searching for a crack in the noose closing around him. He saw the herd gathering, now drawn by the noise. Gores and bestigors emerging from the shadows, weapons in hand, eyes bright with anticipation. They formed a ring, the same way they had for the first hanging. They didn't come to save him. They came to watch. Zealotry had a simple appetite. It always wanted a spectacle. Varkul raised his staff, and the corpses surged in unison as if pulled by a single string. Gothak met them head-on, smashing, stabbing, shoving, but every strike only bought him inches. The roots kept tugging. The tree kept helping. The shard's pulse grew louder in his skull, a drumbeat urging surrender. Then Varkul attacked. He moved faster than Gothak expected, lean and vicious, his staff lashing out with sharp, snapping strikes. The two shamans circled at the tree's base, their feet slipping in ash and sap. Varkul's blows were precise, cruel. He aimed for joints, for wounds, for places that would compromise. Gothak answered with brute force and desperation. He swung wide, drove forward, tried to break Varkul's rhythm with raw aggression. Staff met staff with cracking impacts that jolted arms numb. Fetishes snapped and scattered. Sparks jumped from copper wire. Varkul darted in close and raked a hooked charm across Gothak's cheek, opening a line that stung cold. Gothak responded by slamming his horn into Varkul's shoulder, sending him stumbling back with a hiss of pain. The herd roared approval, then quieted again, waiting to see which shaman would fall first. Varkul straightened, eyes blazing. "You could have been remembered," he snarled. "Instead you'll be meat in a rope." He thrust his staff forward, and the roots obeyed. They surged up, wrapping Gothak's waist, his arms, pinning his staff tight against his body. He strained, muscles screaming, but the roots were stronger. The tree had been drinking too long. The noose above them swayed, lowering slightly, as if leaning down to greet him. Gothak looked up at it, and in that instant, something clicked into place. The shard didn't guide. It fed. The tree didn't bless. It ate, and the herd, in its hunger, had become nothing but a mouth. If Gorthak couldn't destroy the shard with force, he would poison it with something it didn't expect. Defiance. He stopped struggling. The sudden stillness made Varkul hesitate, suspicion flickering across his face. Gorthak's cracked lips peeled back into a grin that held no joy. "You want it?" he rasped. "Then watch what it drinks." With a violent wrench, he twisted his body not to escape, but to align himself beneath the noose. The roots tightened, confused by the change, but in tightening they hauled him upward. The loop slipped over his horn and down around his neck. The herd fell utterly silent. Varkul's eyes widened. No, Gorthak's hands, pinned as they were, still managed to press the shard hard against his chest. He focused on the pain, on the fear, on every instinct screaming to fight, and he refused. Not a prayer, not a plea, a curse, a final offering not of submission, but contempt. He threw his will into the shard like a stone into a still pond, forcing the crystal to drink something bitter, not worship, not terror, but refusal so absolute it turned the moment sour. The rope went taut. The shard flared blindingly bright. The stag tree screamed. It wasn't sound alone, it was vibration. A shudder through roots and wood and bone, a wave that made the herd stagger. The bark split in long, jagged fissures, and dark sap gushed out like spilled ink. The faces in the knots contorted, their silent grins twisting into something like panic. Varkul lunged for the shard as if he could snatch it from the air, but the roots that had served him a heartbeat ago turned on him. One whipped across his legs and toppled him. Another coiled around his wrist, dragging him toward the trunk. His scream very human, for a beastman cut through the stunned hush. Fire leapt suddenly across the glade. One of the pits flared as if fed by invisible oil. Flames climbed the stag tree's bark, hungry and fast, racing along the antler branches. The nooses caught and burned, cords snapping, bodies dropping in heavy thuds that kicked up ash. The herd broke into chaos, some fleeing, some howling, some charging mindlessly at the blaze as if violence could solve it. The forest itself seemed to recoil, trees creaking, leaves shaking in a wind that had not existed a moment before. At the base of the stag tree, the shard cracked, a sound like ice breaking on a deep lake. Its glow sputtered, dimmed, then collapsed inward. The runes froze, then flaked away like dead skin. Varkul clawed at the roots, trying to free himself, but they dragged him into the split bark as though the tree meant to swallow him whole. His voice muffled, then cut off, and Gorthak hung in the burning light, motionless, his defiance spent, his body a final weight on the rope. The noose blackened around him. Then it snapped, and he fell into the ash at the tree's base, finally released. The stag tree burned until its antler branches collapsed in showers of sparks. Roots writhed and curled, then went still. The hanging glade filled with the stink of smoke and scorched sap. By dawn, only a blackened stump remained, split and hollow, its bark faces reduced to cracked charcoal. Silence returned slowly, like a predator settling back into the brush. Days later, when the surviving beastmen crept back to the glade drawn by hunger and superstition, they found it empty of worship. A single noose, charred black, still hung from a surviving branch stub like a memory that refused to die. Beneath it, among the ash and split roots, the waystone shard lay dull and cracked, its surface lifeless. But nearby, in soil still dark with old offerings, a new sapling had pushed through, small, crooked, its first branch bent outward, already forming the shape of an antler, and when the wind finally returned to the Drakvold, it seemed to linger there a moment longer than anywhere else, stirring the blackened rope as if testing its swing.